Is that a strong enough clap?
You can go again if you want. Perfect.
Okay.
Cool.
No, I know. You didn't like that one. Cool. So welcome to a new table, new episode, new guest. Very excited about this one because this obviously is close to home. We are here with accredited psychotherapist and counselor, Nigel Cadman.
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So obviously at a new table, we talk about everything when it comes to having a sustainable life and, you know, from the inside out. So we've talked to farmers, we've talked to people in fashion, but also when we talk about living sustainably, I think mental health is a really important aspect of that. Mm-hmm. So you're here today to chat about all things mental health.
Okay.
Yeah. You're saying this as if you're surprised, as if we've not prepared. And so just to, obviously just to set the scene on where we're at, you have a practice where you live in Nantwich, but today we're in London, actually. Thank you for coming down with your son. And we're in these beautiful offices called X+WHY, X+WHY being our sponsor for this episode, who have graciously lent us also this venue. A little bit about the company. They're a sustainable B Corp certified flexible workspace concept. They've got 7 locations in London. They're really a great company and they're super impact driven. They work with professionals and companies that share the same values. And today we're in one of their newest locations. I'm not sure if it's been like kind of publicly shown yet, but it's at, we're right by the Marble Arches. It's a beautiful location at 1 Cumberland Place, Great Cumberland Place. Anyway, so I think this is going to be like a really great collaboration because they are like, they're all about mental health. So yeah, anyways, thank you for joining us for this chat.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
So I usually like to sort of introduce our guests and to be able to give a sense to our audience their accreditations, because obviously we like to have our experts be able to speak from their lens on what they feel is important for people to know about when it comes to like living more sustainably. So walk me through a little bit about your career. Like tell us a little bit about your professional path.
Okay.
Why we should listen to you.
I think it's quite complicated. So I started in a corporate career, so I worked in HR, worked in industrial relations, did that for many years in some fairly big, well-known brands. I won't name them here, but car industry, aviation, financial services. Then went through a career change about 7-8 years ago, studied psychotherapy, now work in private practice, and I suppose that's quite good to have a range of perspectives, because I have a lot of people come and see me now with mental health issues that have maybe been created in the workplace, and so that kind of gives me an ability to see things, I guess, from different angles. I think in terms of people I see with mental health issues, it's quite hard to describe it because there's an absolute breadth. So people come along with issues that maybe they've had short-term experiences of, sometimes it's been lifelong experiences of. Sometimes it can be around particular issues like relationships, it can be around work, it can be around family, it can be around anything really. So it's a really, really rich tapestry, if you like, and absolutely fascinating, and a really, really interesting subject. And I suppose my real worry about mental health right now is a kind of battle I think we're losing.
What do you mean?
I think we're seeing more and more mental health issues. I think every year in the UK since 1993, we've seen the numbers go up and up and up. And I think the way we're viewing mental health, I think we're trying to commoditize it. So we're sort of trying to simplify it, if you like. We're saying to people who've got depression, here's a list of of 9 things, how many boxes can you tick? And there's a sort of an implication with that the more boxes you tick, the deeper your depression. And I'm not sure that's particularly true. And then the way we're treating mental health is becoming more commoditised, isn't it? So we're looking at 6 CBT sessions and thinking that that's going to cure a lifetime of depression. I'm not really sure that's particularly appropriate. And we're handing out more and more antidepressants, and whilst antidepressants do work for some people, they're not a long-term solution to a mental health problem. Mm-hmm. So I think we're seeing a lot of reoccurrence of mental health issues because we're not addressing the fundamental causes.
I'm not surprised that you're saying that because, like we were chatting earlier, I think, on one end, it's like the topic of mental health, talking about mental health, how to understand mental health, I think is something a lot more common nowadays. I think there's definitely less taboos around that. It's definitely a little bit destigmatized, but at the same time, this is 2.5, 3 years out of a, worldwide pandemic. It's definitely, I think, had a lasting impact on the way that we live our lives. And I think we've seen a big correlation with how that's impacted our, general well-being, but also our mental health. Mm-hmm. And then, so on one end, it's like we live in a society that's a lot more comfortable talking or approaching these topics, but also at the same time, it's like, are we approaching it the right way? I think there's a lot of noise that happens on social media, and we've got these like you said, self-help quizzes and things like that, checking boxes. But at the same time, there's experts in the field like you who are there to help people and to guide them in the right way. And so, yeah, I don't know if you've noticed a trend from how things were 10 years ago and the ease that you had working in this space versus now, and how things are and how you've had to adjust. And
I think, as we were saying when we talked earlier, I think it's easy to focus on the pandemic and say the pandemic changed a lot of things. I'm not sure the pandemic really changed that much. I think what the pandemic did do is accelerated a lot of things. So, we talked about that journey from, say, a cashless society. The pandemic accelerated that, didn't it? Perhaps things have happened 10 years earlier than perhaps they would have done ordinarily. I think it's the same with mental health. The trend was already here. I think the pandemic just accelerated it.
Okay, that's interesting.
And I think the fact that we had, quite a lot of people who were holed up maybe on their own for 2.5 years has probably accelerated it much, much quicker. But within that bubble that was created when people were in lockdown, social media then became more and more and more important, didn't it? So people are talking about mental health a lot more on social media. I think you're right. There's definitely a trend where people are finding it easier to talk about mental health. We're definitely moving in the right direction. But again, as I said to you earlier when we were talking, people who come and talk to me and present, yeah, they are talking about their mental health, but they're not giving the full picture. Very, very few people I find sit down with a friend or with a loved one and say, here's the open book, this is everything about my mental health, these are the things I worry about, these are the things I'm scared about. They tend to share just aspects of their mental health, maybe the things that are more acceptable, but very, very few people I find in my experience throw the whole doors open and say, hey, this is me, these are the demons that I battle. I think a lot of people still keep a lot of stuff to themselves. And if I was to find one aspect of depression for people that I find most concerning, it is the loneliness. I think most people who are depressed are very, very lonely because they either feel that they can't share or they're not able to share, or they feel if they do share, people will view them differently or maybe even cut them off.
Well, I mean, obviously people who are struggling feel very lonely, have a hard time connecting. And when you lose that sense of connection, you lose that sense of support. And I think support is a really big, important part of living a happy, healthy life. But would you say at the same time also being disconnected does breed depression, anxiety, sadness in people? I mean, we talk about when we were in lockdown, and obviously social media became really important because it was one of our only methods of staying connected to the rest of the world and to our loved ones. And so, in a way, like, that was really helpful. But I think being with yourself between four walls for people who didn't live in a kind of like family household, people who are living alone, then it's like you don't realize over time how that can impact you and on a day-to-day basis. Like it's almost like your surroundings can just as much feed into how you feel inside than like how you feel inside does feed into how you set up your surroundings, right?
Yeah, and I think the way we live has changed enormously, hasn't it? If we go back 50 years or so, we had this thing about the nuclear family, didn't we? Everybody living in, 4.2 people living in a house. Around a quarter of people these days live alone.
Yeah.
And that's been accelerated now by, pandemic again, hasn't it? People working from home. If you live alone and then you work from home, some people can go days without actually having any proper interaction with anybody. So there's a large number of people in society who are very, very isolated, don't have that much human contact. Most of their contact with other people is through social media or through the phone or through FaceTime or something like that. So for everybody that really loves working from home because it really works for them, because of childcare or whatever, there's somebody else who actually feels massively excluded from society. So I get lots of clients who say, I'm forced to work from home, but I don't want to work from home. I want to work in the office because that's the only social interaction that I get.
Right. That's your, I was going to say outlet, but that's your source of input, of that social connection. And
yeah, the only live conversations I've ever have are with kind of work colleagues. Although again, interestingly, lots of people then decide to make the journey into the office. But when they get there, there's nobody there.
Yeah.
Because everybody else is working from
home. It's very
home.
depressing.
Yeah. So I think it's just a big, big change in society and the way we live. We are very isolated. We've become very antisocial. A lot of social interactions we used to have, like going into the bank or going into work, we don't do those things anymore. We don't even go to the stores, do we?
It's so interesting that it's like when we say we're living in a society and a reality that, makes us collectively very antisocial. And it's almost like, it's weird to think that because at the same time, like, we're socially connecting all the time, every hour, either by texting or like WhatsApp or social media, Instagram, reading the news. We feel like we're interacting with the world, but it's done in almost a little bit more inorganically. And I do think that has an impact long term on people. And we're seeing that today, obviously.
I think it comes back to the subject that's dear to your heart, doesn't it? We don't really live in our communities. We don't actually talk to the people we live next door to. We don't talk to the person in the local store. We don't talk to the person up the road. We kind of connect with people on the other side of the world, don't we, who we don't really know. So we're having conversations on social media with people who are miles away, but we're not having a conversation with the person who lives downstairs. We're completely disconnecting from our own environment, our own community, and having these sort of, dare I say it, slightly abstract relationships with people who we don't really know.
I mean, and when we talk about we talk about mental health, obviously, like, our environment is a very big factor of that. Our communities, our home environment, our work environment. I think the way also, like, we set up our lives, because we were talking about mental health from a very holistic perspective, right? Like how we, the activities we engage in, right? We talk about how exercise is so connected to mental health, nutrition, and things like that. The kinds of, I won't say content or media, but the things we do expose ourselves to, it all has an impact. And I think then that becomes very difficult sometimes to almost pinpoint, like, what's the source that's causing us to struggle in our mental health, because there's so many different aspects that could come into play. I don't know if you get that a lot, where people are just, I'm not doing well, I'm struggling, I don't know why, because like everything on paper seems to go fine, and yet not sleeping, have anxiety, I'm stressed.
Yeah, I think people are a bit disconnected, aren't they, sometimes from our mental health. You're right, it's a direct consequence very often to the environment in which we live. And that can be, you know, our loved ones, our family, our friends, our relationships, our work, the kind of TV programs we watch, the computer games we play, the amount, you know, the content, the social media stuff we look at. That is the environment that we create around us, and that clearly has an impact on our mental health. So if you look at the state of the nation's mental health, say in the 1950s, people lived very different lives then, and they lived in a completely different environment, an environment that would be sort of unrecognisable today. But quite often I think people present with mental health issues but don't quite understand how much impact they can have on the environment that they live in. You know, they can make choices around what TV programs they watch and the impact that those TV programs have on their mental health, how it makes them feel. Even their social interaction with friends and family can have a massive impact upon how we feel. But quite often people don't realise that they can make those choices. You know, spend less time with this person if they are a bit of a drag on how you feel, versus spend more time with this person because they make you feel good and they boost your confidence. In the same way that people continue to work in jobs that make them feel terrible because they don't feel that they can make the change. But they kind of absolutely can. And then you're right, definitely, the more time people tend to spend out and about in nature, their mental health does seem to be better. But people don't always make that connection.
Do you feel like where our biggest problem is we don't even realize that we're operating on autopilot sometimes?
Partly that, and I think we forget how much we people please. You know,
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, sometimes somebody that doesn't make you feel great says, do you want to come for a coffee? And so we go for that coffee because we don't want to upset them, but we discount the fact that it's not going to make us feel great. So, you know, we don't say no very easily in this society, do we? Because we think it's really, really offensive. So we just say yes to everything.
Right. And it's like at the expense of what?
It's the expense of our own mental health, isn't it?
I like that you talk about how to some level we do have a choice, or, you know, a level of agency in our lives. I think one of the most important things about these chats that we try to have here is, you know, how people can walk away with some real tangible, practical tips on how to just like improve how they operate and go through life. And it's a little bit difficult, I find, sometimes having this talk. When we talk about mental health, we talk about people struggling. It's not to discount the unfortunate circumstances that we can sometimes go through that are out of our control. You know, I hate to use that word, victim, but we are all victims sometimes of unfortunate events and circumstances that cause us to like lose our balance, and that sucks. But I think to like put things back in perspective, everybody is always struggling. Everyone goes through challenges. There's always somebody that's going to be struggling a little bit more than you. There's always somebody who's going to be struggling a little bit less, wherever you stand, you know, on the scale of like, or the social ladder or success ladder. What's important to remember is, while it doesn't discount these things that are very unfortunate, that can be out of our control, there is a level of agency we do have up to a certain extent on how we would choose to navigate then, how we would navigate through these situations. And we can choose to do it in a way that's a little bit kinder and a little bit more proactive and a little bit more productive. So it's, I think when we talk about how we can choose to help our mental health, it's not coming from a place of blaming people who haven't been doing it to the best of their ability, but it's just like a nice reminder that you can be empowered to some level into your happiness, right?
Yeah, I think everybody has choices, don't they? And socioeconomic circumstances can mean some people have got more choices than other people. what I see a great deal of is when people very often are struggling with their mental health, they develop some really good habits. So they do things like they drink a lot more water, they might eat better, they might eat more fruit and vegetables and things, they might go for walks, they might join the gym.
People struggling with their mental health,
Yeah,
but are doing something about it.
But they will develop really good habits, and that's great, and they get a whole lot better. But then sort of human nature kicks in, and when they feel better, they stop doing some of that stuff. You know, and then they'll represent and say, "Oh, I'm depressed again," and then they reach back for those good habits that they had developed. Excuse me, that they then stopped doing. So I think there's definitely a message there that when you develop good habits, when you feel better, you need to keep doing the good things, because actually that's what will sustain your mental health.
Right. Even if you don't realize, everything does have some sort of an impact. If it's feeding your soul, if it's feeding your body really well, I mean, good sleep, nutrition, like you said, exercise, enjoying nature a little bit, surrounding ourselves with in good moments, with good relationships, socializing, connecting. These are all things that directly or indirectly are helping us.
It's that stuff we talked about a lot. You know, it's about sustainability, isn't it? You get a lot of people who get mental health issues, say, related with work, and then they take some time out, and then they feel heaps better. But then they just go back to work and behave exactly how they did prior to taking some time out.
Right.
And it's no surprise that they end up right back where they were at the beginning.
Depressed all over again.
Yeah, because they haven't sustained the changes. So when you start to address your mental health problems, whatever interactions you put in place, you have to sustain them. You can't just drift back to where you were, because you'll just get the same result all over again.
I feel like when you say that, I'm just thinking about how a big key to that is having a real awareness, like being really clued in to all of the things that factor in our mental health. You know, I think, like, going back on this whole, like, do we operate as a society on autopilot and we don't even realize it? How often are we not even connecting the dots, where we are there saying, oh, my relationship isn't very good, I'm in a job that I dislike, I'm not eating great, and I'm also depressed, I don't know why. You know, and it's like we're not connecting the dots. We're not actually making a real inventory of our lives and assessing, okay, there's a lot of things right now that aren't going great. This might actually have an impact as to, like, why I'm feeling so poorly, or why I'm feeling so demotivated, or right?
Yeah, I think, but as a species, we have this natural bent towards, we put up with things, don't we? We have inaction. You know, we all observe this, not just me, but we all observe people who are in really lousy, toxic relationships, but they don't escape the relationship. They hang in there because there's something about, maybe people will change, or maybe things will get better. People work a terrible job, have a terrible boss, but they still hang in there. They tell everybody how awful it is, but they don't do anything about it. And so I think all across our lives, sometimes we kind of have a lot of clues about what's going on.
We're just not listening.
Yeah, but we're prone to inaction, aren't we? We're really good at giving other people advice, you know, as you and I both do. But we're not always very good at taking that advice. So it's great for the people to change, but we're not very good at addressing the core issues in our lives.
Yeah.
We kind of hope against hope that they're going to get better.
I think for me, what I've, you know, and I know in our, like, many chats, I've referenced Andrew Huberman a lot, Dr. Andrew Huberman, and his podcast. And for me, when I've been going on, so obviously, like, I think mental health has been, like, a huge part of what I care about for a long time. And I've addressed my own at different phases in different ways. And what I found really interesting in the last couple of years, especially the last few years, is also in parallel of addressing it with, you know, talk therapy and things like that, looking at understanding myself and my brain from, like, just a neurological perspective, like real objective science. Our brains are wired to borrow the path of least resistance. Our brains are lazy. So to remind ourselves, okay, like this is the default formula. And so if I'm in a environment, or I'm in doing a job that I loathe, or that's not bringing me a lot of purpose, and the idea of changing over to something that might be a little bit more purposeful and more motivating, that feels really difficult. And it's probably because it's unfamiliar. We almost are more comfortable to exist in something that's familiar, even if it's not good, rather than jump into the unknown towards something that might have the potential to bring a little bit more value to our lives. So I don't know, I guess, like, would you say in terms of like mental health, it's a little bit like going to the gym and developing that discipline, that good habit? It's always really difficult in the beginning to almost like reroute and rewire our thinking. But then at some point, new habits kick in, and that becomes the new familiar. And it's almost like once you're on a roll, it's easier to keep going. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I think there's a massive disconnect, isn't there, between how we present the way that we think and the kind of thoughts we have in our heads, in terms of how we present that to the wider world versus what's really going on inside. So we've got this concept, haven't we, of normal, and we all like to comply with that, I think, to a certain extent. And the reality is, you know, each of us inside have some absolutely crazy thoughts, don't we? We do it all the time. You know, we have those thoughts about, well, what if I did that, or what if I did the other? But we don't really share those very much because everybody else around us would think we were crazy. But that's actually not true, because everybody else is having those thoughts. You know, it's like if you put 100 people in a room and say to them, so who talk to themselves, it takes one brave soul to say, yeah, I do. And then the other 99 people put their hands up and go, yeah, so do I. But at that first point where you ask the question, everybody's like sitting on their hands, aren't they? Because they don't want to be the first person to admit it. So I think there's something about us being more open and honest about what our brain functions are like and how we think and how we feel. But I think we spend an awful lot of time trying to present ourselves as conforming to how we think we should be than actually how we really are. So there's a lot more going on in here about our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with the world, than we really let on.
Well, you said something right there, our relationship with ourselves. I mean, we talk about like social stigma around mental health, and obviously the fear of being judged by others, but really, would you say that we are also hugely judgmental of ourselves?
Yeah, I think we scrutinise ourselves in a way that is much deeper than anybody else scrutinises us, don't we? In social conversations, if somebody else makes a simple mistake, you know, they use the wrong word, we just laugh it off, don't we? We don't stigmatise them for doing it. It's just what happens, isn't it? It's easy. But when we do that, we really beat ourselves up afterwards, don't we? And we kind of think everybody else has judged us, and we're going to think they think ill of us, or they think we're, you know, illiterate or whatever, I don't know. But we're much tougher on our own mistakes and quite forgiving of other people's mistakes. So we think other people scrutinise us far more than they actually do. But then equally, we scrutinise ourselves far, far more than we scrutinise anybody else. It's just the way of being, I think.
In what you've seen in your practice, because I mean, you've been addressing mental health, like you said, at like a corporate level, but now obviously, and at a public level, but obviously now in like your one-on-one counseling that you do. What do you think is the thing that holds people back sometimes for not just affecting changes in their lives that could help them, but even just like approaching that topic with themselves in the first place?
I think firstly, once you wear a mask for a very, very long time, you almost start to believe your own bullshit, if you like, don't you? So you've presented yourself in a particular way. You've convinced everybody else around you that you don't have any mental health issues. You've convinced everybody else around you that you're fine. having done that for quite an extended period of time, it's quite a big climb down, isn't it, to say, hi guys, this has all just been a bit fake. Actually, I'm not okay. I'm not all right. Actually, I worry about this, or I'm concerned about that. You're not just presenting how you feel, but you're actually presenting a major change, aren't you, in terms of what you've already put out there. So I think that can be really, really difficult to do. And I think there's part of us that maybe buys into that. I think we believe that we are okay, and actually to admit it and to publicly say, actually, I do struggle with this, or I do wrestle with that, actually doesn't just change your relationship with the wider world, but maybe it changes your relationship with yourself.
Right. It's like, I know with some people that I've had chats with sometimes over the years, it's almost like people are afraid to like open their own cans of worms by being like, okay, well, if I go down that path, and like, I don't know what's down there. And it's almost like this fear that then addressing one challenge means I'll probably have to address the 10 other ones that I've been suppressing. Yeah. And that's not a battle that, some people are just prepared to tackle, right?
Yeah, and lots of people present for therapy. They'll come and talk, but they don't really say what's wrong. They just pleasantly talk for an hour, and then maybe come along 3 times, and then usually, 5 minutes from the end of the 3rd session, they'll suddenly blurt out what's wrong. So it's taken them best part of 3 hours to get to actually saying that there is something they want to talk about, but they usually say it right at the end of a session because they want to get out through the door pretty damn quickly after they've said what's wrong. So I think people find it really, really hard to open up.
I like the idea of talking a little bit about the therapy process, because one could be very familiar with it. I'm sure many people right now have this idea of what it could be like from what you see in TV shows or in movies, or where it's like a very sterile environment and somebody's lying on the couch talking, or there's a whole bunch of paint splatter drawings that make no sense, and it just or like super Freudian approach to understanding ourselves. But so you talk about talk therapy. That's mainly, I guess, how we would say that the services you offer to people, right?
Yeah, person-centered therapy, yeah.
And so what's that process like for somebody who, let's say, would be interested in that? What's the experience like? What is really the therapist-patient relationship like? What's that dynamic like?
I think as much as possible to try and have a really balanced relationship, so there's no sort of power dynamic in the room. I think for the person that shows up, they have a lot of control, or they have all the control. They talk about what they want to talk about. If they don't want to talk about something, well, don't talk about it. So it's for them to go on an exploratory journey, if you like, about learning to share, learning to talk, but them setting the parameters in terms of what they want to talk about, but perhaps just as importantly, what they don't want to talk about. I think them feeling that they're not being judged, feel like there's somebody that's on their side and that understands. And I think the important thing for the therapist is people talk about empathy quite a lot in society, and I don't think we always quite mean empathy when we talk about that. It's about trying to see something and see things from the other person's perspective. So it's when somebody talks about something, it doesn't really matter what I think about that. It's about being able to see that from their perspective and how it feels for them, because obviously it's about their unique experiences. So I think in terms of seeing a therapist from the client's perspective, it should be really empowering. It's their time, it's their place, and it should feel safe. They shouldn't feel like they need to talk about anything that they don't want to talk about.
Right, and I mean, when you say that we're in a society where we don't realize to how much of an extent we people please, it's probably really important to have these moments of times where we have this like safe place to just, it's all about me and what I want to talk about, what I want to get off my chest. As the professional in the room, what's your role though in that conversation? Like, you know, is it about guiding the conversation in a certain way? Is it just passive listening? Is it advice? Like, what's that like?
I think it can vary from the individual to individual. I think as much as it's to encourage, I think it's to make people feel that whatever they're saying is okay. There's you know, people often say, "Am I crazy?" and you kind of got to dispel that very, very quickly. I think it's about creating a safe space. And I think for a lot of people, the feedback I get from clients tends to be the thing that they find most positive is just being heard. It's amazing across society how people just don't feel heard.
Wow.
No one actually listens to them or is prepared to hear what they've really got to say. Because I think sometimes people feel like they're screaming for help, but nobody actually picks it up. Nobody hears it. Maybe they're only hinting, maybe they don't hint well enough. People are very often struggling in society and looking for help, but they're not really getting any.
I think being heard can result in feeling acknowledged, you know, validated. Somebody doesn't necessarily have to agree or relate to what somebody's going through, but just knowing somebody's like witnessing them and acknowledging their struggle, I think can go a long way.
Yeah, because quite often I think people say they talk to friends or they talk to family, and they might say something like, "I'm really, really suffering with anxiety," and rather than that family member saying to them, "Okay, so tell me more," they tend to reply with, "Oh, well, I get that too." So it almost becomes a competitive environment as to whose anxiety is greater, rather than somebody feeling heard and validated around having somebody who's really prepared to listen to maybe the underlying causes of their anxiety or how they experience the anxiety.
Right. No, I get that, because I mean it's very hard, let's say, as a person with your own experiences, you have your own biases, if you will. It's hard to really not overstep, not compare, not judge, and not try to inject yourselves in that person's sharing of their experience. I mean, I'm thinking about how, you know, when people lose a loved one and they go through that grief, and, you know, it's talked about a lot, how like the worst thing that you could say to someone when you offer them your condolences is to say, "Oh, you know what, like, I've been through it too. And like, I get where, I know exactly what you're going through, or I've experienced the same thing." And it's not to, again, I'm not trying to poo-poo on the good intention. You're trying to create a moment of connection and to see, "Oh, you're not alone, like I'm here for you." But it then unfortunately translates in, I'm discounting your experience as being completely unique. And then that can feel very discouraging to someone, because at the end of the day, we all go through the same stuff at the end of the day. We all experience grief. We're all going to lose loved ones. We all go through heartbreaks. We're all possibly going to experience unhappiness in work, or, you know, fail at things. Sure, but everyone is entitled to feel like their experience can be acknowledged as unique, even if it can be relatable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's completely right, isn't it? Whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, menopause, bereavement, the titles are the same in terms of what we're going through, but the way people experience that is vastly different. You know, when people go through bereavements, for example, the feelings are completely unique to the individual, and how they feel it, how they deal with it, is entirely unique. And you're right, people can be quite clumsy, can't they, around bereavement? This is sort of a whole thing about wanting to make people feel better or say the right thing, but none of that really helps, really, does it? You've got to leave an individual to move through a bereavement process in the way that's right for them. And I think there's this whole collision between how society views bereavement and how individuals view bereavement. Society seems to have this view that bereavement's one of those things that, "Oh, just get over it in 3 months." the reality is a lot of bereavements take 3-4 years, even a lifetime sometimes, for people to move through. And there's not really the right level of empathy from society that understands just what a raw experience bereavement can be. And yeah, you get people making quite inappropriate comments. It's almost trying to cheer people up when they're plunging through the depths of bereavement. It's quite insensitive in a way. But none of us, me, you, or anybody, can really understand how somebody else experiences something, because we genuinely don't know.
Right. Yeah. And
how could we?
Everybody responds to different things. Everybody needs different things. Some people need space, and like you said, just listening. Going for a walk around the block, walk it off, doesn't necessarily work for everyone, right?
And at any point in time when we experience something, we bring our previous experiences with us, and those experiences are completely unique. So what might trigger somebody into anxiety is completely different for somebody else, because we all have our own spin, don't we, from our experiences previously that might have an impact on how we experience something now.
I like how you said before that, it's a sort of a common pattern of your clients, people that you do have sessions with, and most of them all say at some point, like, am I crazy? And I think that this is so interesting, because we talk about mental health and we equate it to, if you have mental health issues or challenges, you are mentally disturbed, or you're crazy, or you're not a functional human being. And I think it's kind of like it can be very black and white, but just for the sake of the conversation, mental health, it exists on such a spectrum, right? You can have long-term challenges. Sometimes some can be just circumstantial.
Yeah, but I think when people say that, am I crazy? I think they're feeling like they're looking for validation, aren't they? It's like, am I massively different to everybody else? Yeah. Am I the same as everybody else, or am I massively different? They're kind of trying to get a feel for that. And I could say, almost without contradiction, almost everybody that comes to see me, I could say, well, you're just in the range with everybody else. You're not a standout. You're just like everybody else. You're just like me almost. Because as I said earlier, we all have these random thoughts that kind of fly around in our heads, and we don't really share those with people, do we? But we all have them, but sometimes we feel like we're the only one. So I think a lot of clients will say to me, sometimes irrationally, I have suicidal thoughts, but that's really, really common. But I don't think other people quite realise that having suicidal thoughts is pretty common across the whole population. Most people kind of have them randomly from time to time, but some people will present and say they're really, really concerned about it, but they're only having one thought once a month. Well, that's probably on par with most of the general population, but they're really concerned about it because they think they're a standout, and actually they're not.
It's not to say that, obviously, not to dilute the importance of still addressing it, but I think, like you said, it's just to say everybody's a little crazy, right? There's no shame in going through hard times, kind of spinning out of control. Sometimes it's not out of the norm, in the sense not to discount the uniqueness of your experience, but just to say it's okay. It can definitely get better. Right? Most people will go through hard times in their lives. Some maybe worse, some less than you. There's a light at the end of the tunnel.
But I think there's a mismatch, isn't there, between how society views itself, so how we like to view the world that we live in, if you like, versus the reality of what the world is actually like. So I think, for a lot of people, there's no concept that at any point in time, maybe around 1 in 5 people has got a mental health issue going on, is actually getting treatment for it. There's no real concept in wider society that around a quarter of women between about 16 and 24 are self-harming on a sort of daily basis. We don't see society like that. It doesn't feel good, does it, to see those sorts of statistics? So I think we think that the mental health of the country is way better than it actually is. And we'll leave the people with the mental health issues to deal with it themselves. And then it's quite natural for them to feel like, well, am I the only one? Am I unique? Because we don't really spread the propaganda, do we, that this is a much bigger problem than it is, because maybe on a societal level that would tell us that we've got a much bigger problem than we actually have. And maybe the way society functions probably does need to change, but does society really want to do that? It probably doesn't. So we'll kind of create this as a minority issue rather than it being the much, much bigger issue than it actually is.
So what qualifies as, let's say, a mental health issue? What are things that maybe, I don't know, like people are going through that they might think are normal, or things people are repressing or trying to ignore? It's not just either being sane or insane, right?
It's a really, really wide spectrum, isn't it? There's a diagnostic and statistical manual that defines all the mental health conditions in society, and it's kind of pretty thick. I think, as we talked earlier, mental issues can be, for some people, they can be conditions that they're born with, things like autism, and they're going to be lifelong struggles. People who are born with learning difficulties, and they're going to have aspects of mental health issues that will prevail throughout their lives. It's a daily struggle for those people. Right across the spectrum to some people who might have an occurrence of anxiety for a particular point in their lives, and it arrives at a particular date and it disappears and it doesn't return. Some people can have anxiety issues around a specific event in a particular aspect of their day. The journey to work, for example, can cause huge anxiety, but once that journey's over, anxiety disappears for the rest of their lives. So it is the whole spectrum, from a daily battle to a particular short period of time in your life. And the types of conditions it can include is immeasurable, isn't it?
What have you seen a trend or a shift from the types of mental health challenges or struggles that people have gone or were more commonly going through, let's say 10 years ago, than the stuff that you're now seeing? Or would you say it's like relatively the same? It's more about people being more open about it?
I think far and away what I see, the biggest single issue is anxiety. So we are a very anxious society, and anxiety seems to be very prevalent in young people. So anxiety is probably the single biggest issue.
Young people, how old is that?
Anything from 13 upwards.
13 upwards.
Yeah. So anxiety is a significant issue in society. And it feels that that feels like a condition for a lot of people that they're probably going to battle with for most of their lives.
What do you think causes that anxiety in young people so much nowadays?
I think very competitive peer pressure. I think social media. Even when you look at things like bullying, for example, if you go back 30 years, bullying was one of those things that could start at 9 o'clock in the morning and end at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and only take place Monday to Friday in term time.
Right, at school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the social media age now, bullying is a 24/7 thing. So it's a much, much bigger issue. I think bullying is a much bigger issue than perhaps we realise. I think people just feel under a lot of pressure to be a particular way. We're defining what good looks like through social media, and then people are constantly looking at whether they measure up to that or not. So I think the pressure of being a young person now is off the scale to perhaps what previous generations had to put up with.
What are ways to counter that? I mean, obviously I know that, or I understand that you are there to assist to manage that in people who are experiencing anxiety, young people experiencing anxiety, but what are ways that, let's say, we can almost try to counter it or avoid it, or,
Start to have conversations with people about their relationship with their self. It's about accepting who you are, what you look like, how you behave, how you feel, rather than trying to present as something that you're not. So I think it's about people being genuine about who they are, accepting who they are, and stop searching to be something that they're not. That's the long-term solution for most people, I think. But being able to actually bring that about, I think, is a really, really tough process, because whilst you can have a conversation with somebody about them being more comfortable with who they are, there's this constant pressure, isn't there, from peer groups and from social media about you need to be more like this or you need to be more like that. But there's a sort of there's a real disconnect, isn't there, between how people present on social media versus how they actually are. You know, I always say to people, don't forget you compare how you actually are with somebody else's fantasy that they present on social media, because don't forget those people who present like that aren't actually like that in reality. That's just what they're projecting.
Yeah, everybody posts their highlight reels.
Of course they do. They project the sort of champagne lifestyle out there, but actually their lives are as dreary and boring as ours are in reality, but we don't get to make that comparison. We just see our own lives as quite dull and see everybody else's lives as exciting.
So from what ages do you, do you start seeing people, would you say that like young people, I know teens, the teenage experience is hard. I can't imagine what it's like to go through today as a teen. Would you say that young people have an ease at reaching out for mental health support, or is it the parents that reach out? It
tends to be the parents reach out. Parents tend to be very, very concerned. Usually something's come to light. So it tends to be start with a parental referral, in my experience. From a young person's perspective, that's probably the word, they don't have a lot of perspective. So they get drawn into this patterns of behaviour with young people in terms of, a lot of pressure to do this or pressure to do that, and they don't really know any different. So this sort of fabricated world that they get drawn into feels absolutely real. And, the concept of pulling back from social media and maybe not listening to certain things or watching particular things is such a cornerstone of their world that it's almost impossible for them to draw back from it.
Right.
Probably saying to a child right now, don't watch social media would have been the equivalent in the 1980s of saying you can't watch any more TV. It would have just been inconceivable.
Or just stop talking to people. I mean, it's not
scale.
realistic.
Yeah, it's just off the scale.
So then it's like then it becomes, how do we fortify and strengthen our sense of self, our character, or I know we use that word a lot in therapy, but like, how do we develop tools to help us manage things better? I guess that becomes the objective, right?
Yeah, I think some of it's aligning with reality. One of the key correlations I always think with mental health is mental health and sleep. How good your sleep pattern is tends to dictate, to a large extent, what your mental health condition is like. I don't have any kind of backup data for this, but from my experience of working with young people is young people don't sleep. Young people hide under the covers playing on their phones all night, either watching TikTok or talking to their friends. Parents are largely unaware of that. But kids don't sleep right now. They're up all hours of the night playing games or interacting on their phones and stuff. And so it's not surprising that their mental health isn't great. But we ain't going to get to any kind of solution there until we actually get back into some real basics, that people do need to sleep, we do need to regenerate overnight, we do need to get some rest. But that's increasingly happening with adults as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to tackle how do we strengthen our mental health? How do I start feeling better inside when I'm exhausted and tired? It's like I don't have the bandwidth for that if I'm operating on no sleep. But just so I can understand, is it that struggling with your mental health affects your sleep, or is it that not sleeping enough can have an impact on mental health? Or I guess it's either or, right?
I think it's multifaceted, isn't it? I think some people don't sleep because they're anxious and they don't really feel like sleeping. I think other people just get drawn into the conversations, and so they're playing alone all night, talking or whatever.
Or doom scrolling, just mindless. And then you don't realize, oh my God, 3 hours have passed by.
So quite what the causes are, they're probably quite complex. The reality is we've got a whole generation of people who ain't sleeping too good. But that applies to adults too. You know, I don't meet many adults who I say to them, what's your sleep like? And they say, oh yeah, I get a sound 8 hours every night. That is a real rarity.
So then is that, I'm just trying to think, like, for people at home who are like are starting to grasp, like, okay, mental health awareness, you know, and what is that, how that can play into my life and my reality, that's something to consider. If somebody's not sure that they're struggling with mental health, like, what are the key things that they could look for? Like, okay, I guess, like, clocking if they're not sleeping, that could be a sign.
Yeah, I think how well they sleep. That's also important to remember about sleep. Sleep's only really good for us if we get it in one bout. So we need to sleep through for 6 or 7 hours in one go. Sleeping for a couple of hours, waking up, going back to sleep again for a couple of hours. That's not taking you through the proper cycles of sleep. So it kind of needs to be in a big chunk, if you like. I think that's really important. I think our diet's really important. You know, how are we eating? Are we sitting down and relaxing and eating? Are we grabbing something on the move? Content of what we're eating. So how wide is our diet? Is it quite narrow? Are we eating the same sort of things? Obviously differences between sort of Western diet and Mediterranean diet I think are quite important. Concentration. If we're able to concentrate and we're able to remember things, that tends to tell us that our mental health is quite good. When our mental health starts to suffer, we get quite forgetful. We can't remember people's names. We can't remember where we put things. So the simple mental tasks suddenly become much, much more difficult. It kind of feels busy. It feels a bit foggy up there. I think that's quite important. An ability to concentrate. If you can watch a TV programme or you can read something, people with mental health issues really struggle to do that.
And it's like, okay, so and it's more than just distraction, or it is to be easily distracted.
Easily distracted.
Okay.
And then I think people with mental health issues often describe they fly off the handle quite easily. So they get irritable quite quickly or they get angry quite quickly. So they sort of lose that calmness. So they're the typical traits, I would say, for most people with mental health issues that I would think about. And then probably the last one would be how sociable we are. People with mental health issues tend to be, they cancel nights out, they tend to cancel social visits, they don't like to be in social circles, they tend to start to hibernate. They kind of, we talk about loneliness, but they often create the loneliness, so they stop interacting with people. Like
you almost like avoiding interacting or being in situations that are going to remind you that, like, you're not connecting, you're not able to be happy, you're not enjoying yourself.
So we subconsciously feel like we don't have a great story to tell. So rather than put ourselves in that situation where we have to tell the story, we tend to start to hide a little bit.